I'm not going to talk in great depth about how you might raise funds. I'm going to talk much more broadly about resourcing creative practice, resourcing a creative life, perhaps, and to draw on ethical issues quite broadly. So I will talk about 4 or 5 projects ever so briefly and mention their, how they resource themselves, but it's not. I'm warning you now, it's not a very practical talk. And I am going to look at a script now and again. I'm afraid I'm not I'm not winging it. So if I do have any practical pointers, it's more about an ecological reframing of money and the ways that artists might work as agents for ecological innovation. And so in asking this, you might turn the question on the head. So it's more about thinking maybe that creative practice itself is the most ethical and effective way to resource your life, rather than the other way round. And there's a Kurt Vonnegut quote there. The arts are not a way to make a living. They're a very human way of making life more bearable. So yes, I run a company called Flow that works in the UK and India, and increasingly more internationally, working with partners. I'm not flying around all over the place. I don't really fly. And we work with cultural organisations to develop strategy, and a lot of this is to do with evaluation, to demonstrate impact and to be relevant to various different agendas in order to raise funds and be successful. So really that's what my work has been based on for the last 7 years. So I've been thinking a lot about what is relevant, what does make a cultural organisation relevant to current agendas. But in doing this thinking, I've become more and more vocal and active. This one. I've become more and more vocal and active in thinking about the ethical sponsorship of culture. And there you can see me. I'm visible singing in a choir called Shell Out Sounds, which we do kind of guerrilla singing at Shell-sponsored or BP-sponsored arts events. So, it's very difficult for me to be seen in that light and then to apply for contracts and say, South Bank Centre, please, can I work for you? So I'm slightly anxious that that I've got this list of more and more places I can't work. So, that combined with the fact that I'm increasingly wanting to do more creative practice myself, as someone who is both creative and a kind of thinker, the two things go together. It's causing a lot of anxiety, and I'm going through a transition where I'm wanting to, I'm feeling a lot more like an artist in that vulnerable position of continually having to think how to make a life. So the next slide. He's in a sense an inspiration for me, Joseph Beuys. He says art alone makes life possible, and every day for me I do creative work as well as the work I do for clients, and every day I also do ecological and political work, and the three things connect. And for Beuys, planting trees was a creative act. So I've set up a project to try and unite these things called Boisterous, which is a name invented by my daughter. We were talking about Beuys, and she said, you can be boisterous, which is sort of like being creatively boisterous in the face of climate change. And this project promotes creative actions for trees and the environment through the inspirations of artists and a range of activity days and workshops and so on. And also so promoting artists, for example, the next slide. So I write articles and promote the work of artists like Anne-Marie Culhane, who runs, for example, a project called Fruit Roots, where she works with the University of Lancaster, and the project is funded by the university to help make better use of their campus, which has some fruit trees. So it's kind of looking at resilience and the use of trees for food. I'm also involved, the next slide please, thank you, in a project called the Dark Mountain. I'd be interested to know who's heard of the Dark Mountain project. Is a few, little hands. So the Dark Mountain project, it's all about, it creates a space for artists and a broad range of different people to explore the realities of the ecological collapse that we're facing, and to resist the narratives of growth and to explore new possible narratives. Interestingly, just a brief mention that they're currently raising funds through eBay, using eBay. They've tried a whole range of different ways of raising funds. They don't often apply for grants. Mostly it's about building a network. So they're currently using eBay for auctions. And Dugald Hine is one of its manifesto writers, and he is currently writing a book about collapsonomics, which he describes, when people talk about collapsonomics, they think it's incredibly doom-laden, but he describes it as looking for what will still work when the systems we rely on break down. And he's written about how we need to categorize the different needs that we have when we're thinking about what we get from work. So the next slide is his three categories. There are three levels, really, in what we get from work. The first is economic or practical. How do I pay the rent? How do I eat? The second is social and psychological, which is, who am I in the eyes of others? How do I relate to other humans? And then the third is directional. Why do I get out of bed? Where do I see myself in the future? And I'm wanting to suggest that the directional now has to be, if we want to see ourselves in the future, we have to focus on how biodiverse life and human civilization will continue. So ultimately, there is no other direction for any of our work than enabling life to continue on the planet. Because life on the planet is collapsing. I'm sorry to be raising these big issues, but I think it's essential. So this slide, there's this famous triad of economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And in a way, Dugald's three categories of why we work relate to these. And the way that I think a lot of companies, especially even arts organisations, see and use this triad is often to balance these three dimensions and to sort of juggle them. And so, for example, they'll say, I might, if I fly, then I might offset it in some other way, or what I'm really arguing for is that you don't juggle those balls, but they're actually overlapping, and you focus on what the overlap is. So the overlaps are bearability, being bearable, equitable, and viable. And then at the centre of these overlaps is a whole new mode of economics, which I'm calling oikonomics, which is an umbrella term. You'll probably have heard of many different things like the gift economy, the circular economy, the blue economy, the green economy. All of these things are on a spectrum of what I call oikonomics. And oikos is the origin of eco. It's a Greek word meaning favourable place. And in oikonomics, we focus on what makes a favourable place for us to live in. It's about focusing on our habitat. So the next slide, if we think about an oikonomics of culture, if we think about what the tasks are for artists, they are economic. The economic aspect is an oikonomic valuation and reorganisation of culture. A social aspect is that perhaps artists are responsible for eco-social repair. And this is a term I'm using, eco-social, because there's so much talk about corporate social responsibility or social responsibility. I'm pushing for eco-social as a new understanding. And then environmental is planetary sculpture, that artists can be planetary sculptors. And this is inspired by Beuys's practice of social sculpture. So it's kind of reinventing that and making it much more planetary. So the next slide. I won't go into this in too much detail, actually. I won't read through them. And if you want to, you can go to my blog, which is called The Learning Planet, and you'll find these things in more detail. But one of the things I'm working on is developing, in my evaluation work for arts organisations, a whole new way of valuing culture, which is more oikonomic, and which looks at the various ways that culture can be valued more ecologically. And just one example of an arts project that does honour these values is the next slide, is the Foraged Book Project by Fergus Drennan, who's a forager, and an artist called James Wood. So they're working together. They've currently got an exhibition in Manchester of lots of different work by different artists. But the basic premise is that Fergus is living for a year on foraged food, and the book that they're making about it is entirely made from foraged natural materials. So they're not using any money. You know, they're hoping to sell the book, but they're not expecting to get rich from it. So the next slide, the next aspect is thinking in more detail about oikonomic culture for eco-social repair. You know, I think one of the big aspects, there's a lot of talk about artists' role in communicating climate change. I actually think a really under-considered role for artists is in helping us through the transition, helping us with therapy as resources diminish and as we argue over resources more. But also in helping us be more resilient, helping us connect better in communities. And an example of a project that I think is quite interesting that I'm working with a bit is the next slide, which is the Assembly Project. I don't know if you've heard of the old Tide Mill School in Deptford. They've built a new school, a primary academy, and the old school was sort of earmarked for property development. But these artists are living in it as guardians, and they're using the space for 2 years. It's a little bit like your House of Fairy Tales project, actually. They're using the space for 2 years or so, but really trying to actually conserve and protect the amazing garden that is now an asset for the community, which before only the school kids, and the school hardly ever used it. So they use the garden for exploring medicinal plants, for all kinds of activities that encourage community well-being. And the image there is a workshop that I led, which was making an installation from which explored the functions of mycorrizal networks that connect trees. So it was using trees and fungi as a metaphor for community cohesion. The next slide is about the role of artists as planetary sculptors. I'm not watching the time, so I hope I'm doing okay. I'm okay, a couple of minutes. I think that this is the most interesting and exciting future role for artists, and I'm aware that artistic training doesn't really enable artists to be planetary sculptors, but perhaps there's a course that could be set up, I'm sure. And here are some tasks I think that artists could do. Actually, if you go to a blog called Eco Art Scotland, the man who runs that, he often looks for all kinds of contracts, like an orchard survey, and he says, could an artist do this? And I think that's a brilliant idea. You know, artists could apply to do all kinds of jobs that are to do with reinventing and our environment and making us more resilient. So, you know, looking at how we might save energy, looking at how we might be healthier if we learn from nature, if we work from the intelligence of nature. So next slide. Really, if we want to put these tasks in order of priority, the very top task is the regeneration of the biosphere. And you know, so if we are talking about responsibility, it's important to not just kind of cherry pick your tasks, or to just focus on what feels what you extrinsically are pressured to do, but to really understand, based on evidence, what the key tasks are. And the key task is regeneration of the planet. So, and at the very bottom, you can see the word offsetting, which is, you know, very problematic, but is an important part of environmental action. So the next slide is just a final example of a project by an artist who is a planetary sculptor, and she's Pip Wolf, who's running a project called Woolen Line. I'm not really sure how she's funding this project, but I do know that what she's doing is using sheep's wool that she finds in the environment, so she doesn't need to buy her materials, and she's using that to protect an exposed and burnt hillside to help it regenerate. And she's working with the community in that, and they hold kind of community dinners, and they make the plates, and they try to make everything themselves. So it's all about finding your resources within your environment. So just to conclude then, you might think, you know, we're looking at an image of a work by a Delhi artist called Subodh Gupta. I only bring this in just at the last minute because I do work a lot in India, and there's a whole emerging, art market, and there are all these issues about, globalization and the desire for artists to succeed. So this artist came and showed work at the Frieze Art Fair, and of course there are all these debates about the Frieze Art Fair just being a kind of commodity fest. But anyway, just really to conclude, I think an oikonomic approach is a way to overcome this binary argument that art has either instrumental value or aesthetic value, because I would argue that art has to have economic value, but the economics themselves need reinventing, that they don't have to be about greed, consumption, and planetary death. And also, oikonomics show that there are ways to be an artist that allow you to eat. For example, if you're you can forage as part of your artwork. And that perhaps more nobly might enable more people to eat better in the future. So I think really the challenge is for our cultural institutions, our funders, and our training organisations to embrace an economics of culture, an oikonomics of culture, I should say. Thank you.